So first, let me offer greetings from UKirk, Tallahassee, all the way down at the other end of Park Avenue. It is, as you know, spring break this week, so it's a week of quiet around campus, and might actually get to sleep in every now and then. But I do want to just say a word of thank you while I have the opportunity. Thank you to this congregation for your incredible support of that ministry. We could not do what we do without churches like yours who give and give and give in so many different ways. So I want to simply begin by saying thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for all that you do, both for us and for so many in this community. So the Gospel of John often presents problems for preachers. There is, of course, the general weirdness of John, just kind of generally in comparison to the other canonical Gospels. You know, Jesus is doing different things in John. He doesn't teach in parables. He has all these different kind of set of miracles. Jesus is almost superhuman in John's Gospel. But also because John, a bit unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is filled with these very long, drawn-out narratives that are saturated with just so much imagery. They're just filled with all sorts of amazing stuff. It can be difficult to preach a complete narrative of John because there is so much packed into each pericope. So often what happens in the lectionary is we get these chopped up bits of text from John divorced from their wider context, like we see today, just a few verses from chapter 3. And indeed, this is a text that is particularly susceptible to this problem. When you're reared in a culture like ours, in which Christianity, or at least some individualized, spiritualized version of it, is dominant, nearly everyone has at least passing familiarity with this text, John 3:16. We see it emblazoned on billboards as we travel along the interstate, right? We've seen it written on the black eye paint of football players. It was even parodied by the popular beer-guzzling, cut-off jean short-wearing professional wrestler, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Anybody remember Austin 3:16? Lucas, right? Yeah, Lucas remembers. Yeah. But as I'm sure you know, there are many problems with this kind of contextless use of biblical texts. It evinces a certain way of understanding the Bible as this kind of endless supply of pithy statements or proof texts that can be applied to whatever situation you're dealing with. I remember when I was in high school and I was first kind of discovering and working out what this faith thing meant to me, I was given a book, the name of which I have since forgotten, and I'm sure there are at least hundreds of others like it, that was essentially a compilation of verses from the Bible, kind of categorized by theme according to different issues that you might be facing. So, feeling down about a recent breakup? Well, here's Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. And apparently those plans didn't involve her anyway, so here are 10 other Bible verses that will help you feel better about it, right? Help you get over it. Lacking in confidence today? Well, here's Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Wow, wonderful, right? Now, never mind that Jeremiah wrote his prophecy in response to this incredible national catastrophe that was the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon. Never mind that Paul wrote those verses from a Roman prison. There's a context to those texts that are important, and that if we remove them from that, we miss something deeply important about them. The Bible simply becomes a book of self-help phrases rather than, I think, the more important use of it, which is dealing with the context of these texts so that we can faithfully mine for how they intersect with and speak to our contexts. Context is everything. So at the beginning of John 3, to put this in some context, Jesus is approached by a Pharisee named Nicodemus at night, and this is important, right? Careful readers of John's gospel will know how loaded imagery of light and darkness is, and we see it throughout this text. Jesus is introduced as the light that shines in the darkness, which the darkness did not overcome. So Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, probably symbolic of his lack of understanding of just who it is he's talking to. And very quickly we come to realize that though this Nicodemus comes to Jesus in all sincerity, he is not likely to walk away from this encounter with any new clarity. He doesn't come with a question, but a statement for Jesus. Nicodemus says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God." To which Jesus responds, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born from above." Already in this brief conversation, we kind of see where this is going. It's an odd conversation where Jesus and Nicodemus never seem to be talking to each other. They're kind of talking past each other. It's a bit like a scene from Seinfeld, right? The dialogue in Seinfeld, they're always talking kind of in the direction of each other, but never quite to each other, right? They never quite understand they each have their own kind of concerns, what they're thinking about. They're not really engaged in conversation. They're just kind of saying things in the general direction of each other. And when Nicodemus does respond to Jesus' statement, he completely misunderstands him. There's a play on words that happens here in the Greek. When Jesus tells Nicodemus that he must be born from above, Nicodemus hears born again, because the Greek word that is used here can mean either. So Nicodemus, somewhat incredulously, right, he asks, how is this possible? That someone can be born again? Am I to re-enter my mother's womb, having grown old, to be born a second time? How can that be? Says Nicodemus. Yet strangely, Jesus, rather than correcting this very simple error, right? He could have cleared it up very, very quickly, allows Nicodemus to stew in this misunderstanding and begins to wax poetic about how the Spirit moves. Even weirder is that there doesn't seem to be a clear end to this conversation. It's not quite clear how this encounter ends. Does Nicodemus finally come around? Is he finally able to make sense of what Jesus is talking about? Or does he walk away still not quite sure of what to make of this Jesus character? The other interesting thing is that it's not even clear at the point in the narrative that we read who is even speaking. As I'm sure you're aware, there is no punctuation in Greek, right? There's not even spaces between letters. So punctuation is always an act of interpretation. It's sometimes minor, but it can sometimes be very important. So in other words, there are no quotation marks in the Greek. We have to put them in when we do English translations. So some Bibles will include that famous John 3:16 quote as directly from the mouth of Jesus. But others do not. Others have it more as kind of the influence of the narrator interjecting and speaking those words. Because a common feature of John's gospel is how the narrator's voice often blends seamlessly with the voices of characters in the gospel, especially Jesus. So it's not clear if Jesus is saying this or if the narrator is saying it. But however we make sense of who is saying what here, it's important to keep in mind that this foundational theological statement that most of us have probably heard repeated over and over and over again isn't made in a vacuum, right? It's in the context of this conversation between Jesus and a person who approaches him, a person who is shrouded in misunderstanding, who is confused about who this person is that he's talking to. And at the end of that conversation, Nicodemus sadly doesn't appear to be any closer to understanding the truth. In fact, the two other times that Nicodemus shows up in John's gospel, it's under similarly ambiguous terms. In chapter 7, he is seen with another group of Pharisees as they are debating whether or not what to do with this Jesus guy. Should we have him arrested? And Nicodemus argues instead for at least a modicum of due process. Nicodemus says, "Our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they are doing, does it?" Not exactly a radical statement of faith, right? Kind of bare minimum. And then later, after Jesus' death, Nicodemus reemerges with an inordinate amount of spices to anoint Jesus' body for burial. Now that might seem a little bit closer to acceptance, understanding, belief, who knows? So is he now in the light? Does he continue to walk in darkness? Nicodemus' status remains uncertain. And his uncertain status is especially interesting given the discussion about light and darkness. Because here, Jesus seems to divide people into two categories. You are either in the light or you are in the darkness. Yet Nicodemus himself seems to defy such simple classification. Jesus, or perhaps the narrator, says, "All who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God." But what about Nicodemus? He came to the light, that is Jesus, but he came at night, specifically so that he would not be seen. And there's no clear indication that his interaction with the light has changed him going forward. The ambiguity of Nicodemus' interaction with Jesus, I think, helps elucidate precisely what John means by this all-important verb, to believe. Belief, for John, and hopefully for us, is defined by action. Belief is not static, it is dynamic. I tend to bristle at mention of this verse because of how often it is used in, for lack of a better term, kind of evangelical circles, right? To make the crux of the gospel about belief. This thing that you either have or you don't have. You're either in this camp or you're in that camp. But that's not exactly how John defines belief or thinks about belief. Significantly, the verb to believe, verbal form, appears in John's gospel far more than any of the other gospels. Yet, the noun belief or faith is conspicuously absent. Belief for John is not a thing to be possessed. Believing is something we do. And in this way, it's connected to John's vision of what love looks like. In that famous verse, John 3:16, we are told that God so loved the world that God decided to do something about it. Because love here is a verb. God's love wasn't a feeling. God's love wasn't an idea. God was so moved by God's love for the world that God could not keep that love to God's self. God's love is expressed through concrete action in the form of the Word made flesh, that is Jesus Christ. God offers more than just sincere thoughts and prayers, because love is not just a noun, it is always expressed as an act of love. So like Nicodemus, we too, I think, are confronted with the challenge of how we respond to God's love for the world. Do we think mere belief is enough? Or do we understand that to believe means to do? To love means to do. I am constantly challenged by people around me who take their belief in God's love for the world so seriously that, and this is a crazy thought, it actually changes how they live. I would love to get to a place where that were the case for me. I think especially of my friend Kate, who challenges me all the time. Kate, a few years ago, was fed up, was sick of the epidemic of gun violence that is destroying so many of our communities. She was so sick of it that she decided to do something about it and joined up with the local Moms Demand Action group, which she is now the head of. She and so many others in our community work tirelessly for real, concrete change, actual action behind the words of love and belief. Kate is constantly talking about how her faith propels her to do this great work. She espouses a politics of hope when I find myself retreating into cynicism. And it's easy, for me especially, to retreat into that cynicism. But it's hope that sustains us. It's hope that moves us forward. It's hope that can move us to putting our love and our belief into action. I think also about the remarkable leadership of the Parkland students who were here in our town just a few weeks ago, who were thrust into the national spotlight by tragedy, have taken that pain and have changed the conversation completely. They have taught us all that thoughts and prayers can be put into action, that love can move us. They have shown us what love looks like. They have shown us what it means to believe in something. So the challenge for us then is, what will we do about it? God so loved the world that God did something about it. So if we too claim to believe in the God of love and claim to also love the world that God so loves, then we better be willing to do something about it too. It's time for us to do the same. Amen.